things, but given that this is a more formal session, decided to present something or write something.
Point of order, can
more
we
coherent.
get the volume up at all? Is that possible?
Move the mic
No, it would help
closer.
if you speak into the microphone.
Well, the mics haven't been working at all at this point. We couldn't hear them earlier.
Not on.
Now it's on.
All the lights are blinking. Ours are working.
It's gonna make for good TV.
Decisions are made by bureaucrats every day that decide how adults are to live their lives, with little or no input from those adults. Yet we were founded on the radical idea that individuals were sovereign, with rights given by God, and not the kings and nobility that maintained they ruled by God's diktat. That instead of a government that ruled its subjects, government governed with the consent of its citizens. Government was to be a floor on which these citizens could walk, conducting their lives by their own decisions, as they followed their own ideas of what is the pursuit of happiness. Instead of having that government overhead as a ceiling, sending rulings down from above. So where are we? We have unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats making major decisions not on our behalf, but because it is for the common good. Like, and these are examples, creating a desert in the San Joaquin Valley of California, putting tens of thousands of farm workers out of work, and rich farmlands turning to dust, all because of 3-inch bait fish called the snail darter. All because it benefits us all. I think of the bureaucrat that declared that my toilet could only use so much water for the greater good as I hold my plunger aloft. Once again, the toilet stuck. I think of 2 departments now, the EPA and the NTSB, deciding what kind of car I will buy by doubling the CAFE standards as they decide what kind of energy usage is for the common good. And now another department has decided that their means justifies their ends, and now there's a concern for First Amendment rights being broached over a new unenumerated right at the federal government level. And it's not just at the highest level of government that this happens. In Michigan, independent daycare providers were enrolled by the state into the SEIU union simply at the behest of government, feeling that that would be for the common good. It is now also starting to happen in Connecticut with little or no input from the majority of these providers. A few years ago, David Stamps wrote in the Citizen and the Laconia Daily Sun when the tax cap was being presented in Laconia. And he said that the citizens of Laconia did not need a tax cap. The citizens could trust their government not to overspend. I wrote at the time that the mere fact that someone has brought forward a tax cap petition means that you have already lost the trust of your citizenry. It passed. And now we see similar things happening here in Guilford. No, I'm not necessarily talking about just the tax cap or the petitions, but I would ask that you think about the fact that perhaps trust has been lost instead. That the mere fact that these petitions are being brought forward and that both boards here are refusing them shows that there is a big problem here in Guilford between those that govern versus those that are being governed. Jonah Goldberg wrote a best-selling book called Liberal Fascism, and I'm going to read a couple of quotes from it. And some may pillory me for reading them, but it is food for thought. It is totalitarian in that it views everything as political, and it holds that any action by the state is justified to achieve the common good. A second quote is, but therein lies a common principle. The state should be allowed to get away with anything, so long as it is for good reason. To go back to last night's candidates night, and the video is already up on YouTube. A question was asked about the school board implementing full-time kindergarten. The 3 candidates, Doug Lambert, Kurt Weber, and Sue Allen, stood and answered the question. The chair and the past chair both extolled the results that they were getting, and that it was done at a cheaper cost, that everybody benefited from doing that. And yet they never answered the question, why did they implement it against the vote of the citizens of Guilford? Trust? Simply the means justifies their ends, it seems. Thus, we see these petitions tonight, and I believe that because it is a lack of trust. But what do you say when a board ignores the decisions of voters and just says, for the common good, we will implement this anyways? We see government, as I said before, government overhead is a ceiling, sending rulings down from above. I speak in favor of these petitions because I believe, in part, the trust has been broken. That you now see citizens trying to put up a higher steel fence around their interests versus what government would have to do to them instead of for them, or under the guise of doing something for them. I really do ask that each of you here think about that. I understand it would be a lowering of the power that you have and devolving that power to the citizenry. And yet that's what government's supposed to be, is that it does things for the citizens and by the consent of the citizens and not to the citizens. Thank you.
Still open for comment. Oh, here we go. What do we have?
Dale Dormady, Wild Acres Road. A couple of concerns on warrant articles. One is the article that puts the responsibility for the default budget in the Budget Committee's hands. Be happy to hear otherwise, but I'm a little uncomfortable with the responsibility for both the primary budget and the default budget being in the same body. Right now, the Budget Committee has a complete opportunity to formulate their budget. They are responsible for it, the primary budget. Line by line reviews, we go through item by item. And the default budget, when we're done with that, the default budget currently follows a process. And it's a process that's, I understand, to be relatively complicated, but also laid out in some fairly clear terms. And financial people from the town and from the school are responsible for following those terms. And sure, there's some room for interpretation, but for the most part, it follows a defined process. I'm not so certain that if we take that default budget and put it in the hands of the Budget Committee, it will follow that same defined budget or that same defined process. And frankly, one of the petitioners this evening said the purpose of this warrant article was to allow the Budget Committee to present a lower budget so that the citizens had a choice. And that kind of makes my point about my concern is that the Budget Committee would not be following a process, but would instead simply be defining a lower budget. So it's either take the one we've developed or take this other one, which is much less. I recognize that currently that's the situation in the reverse on occasion. But the default budget currently follows a defined process. I think it should be that way, and the same body shouldn't be responsible for both. As far as the article about moving the voting later until May, I seriously don't believe that the reason we don't get attendance at the deliberative session is weather. I think they're long, detailed sessions, sometimes made longer by a number of paper votes. So I don't think moving it to May is going to bring the doors down on that place. There may be other reasons, that's not one.
Thank you, Dale. But somebody else, please. Got a lot of things spoken.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly,
Doug Lambert.
Doug Lambert, 42 Farmer Drive. I just quickly want to voice my support for the tax cap for the school and the town. And I speak and I put that support as a candidate for the school board, which is one of the boards that would be affected by the cap. And, you know, I think that a lot of the reasons put forth tonight are really valid, so I'm not going to go through all of that again, but I would like to say that I had a discussion with a gentleman today, and he says, well, you know, number one, it's basically a toothless cap. He says, because at the end of it all, it can and most probably will get faulted at the deliberative session. It happens now. whether we've all seen it, and it is unfortunate, and I think, just as an aside, that's why the frustration with the default budget is, yes, the budget committee does create a budget, but in many instances, it gets altered at the deliberative session. So I think that the rationale is people would like to see that budget get a chance to be presented to the voters more or less intact. But back to the tax cap. What I said to the gentleman I was discussing this with was that, yes, it can be altered at the deliberative session and really not much has changed, but it will force the governing bodies and the budget committee to construct a budget based upon the cap. So in the end, if it must get changed at the deliberative session or does, that could happen, yes. But at least the whole structure would be built around the cap. And there would be a lot of work, and in the process of the development of the budget, the people of Guilford could become informed as to the true ramifications as it's reported in the media or gets discussed at meetings. The budget committee does their job, they have public hearings, etc. So, as I said at the deliberative session, it does put the power to raise the budget in the hands of the voters at the deliberative session, and whether as a citizen, Doug, or a school board member, Doug, I'm okay with that. I'm fine with putting the power to raise or not raise our taxes in the hands of the voters of Guilford, because at the end, I trust them. Thanks for listening to me tonight.
Yes.
Sure, go ahead.
I would say to that, Doug, in the deliberative session today or 2 weeks ago when we had it, that power has always been in the taxpayers' hands. It always has been. So by the tax cap, we're not changing that. The power has always been in the taxpayers' hands to vote the budget up, to vote the budget down. The power has always been in the taxpayers' hands. Thank you.
No disagreement there.
In my experience, it always goes up. I
Gary Stewart, Guilford. Thanks for having this session. I was just going to listen, but Dale made a comment about the default process, which has always been a pet peeve of mine. I can tell you from experience that I've had a few very good but frustrating conversations about the default budget with the business manager of the school district. And according to him, it's very black and white and follows a process as Dale had suggested. But I pointed the finger at a couple of places where money was added to as perceived by contracts that benefit directly the student that clearly could be debated as not as such. And I think a number of people could agree that it was not as such. The problem was that at the end of the conversation, right, wrong, or indifferent, I had no place to take any argument further. There's no vehicle to dispute the default budget. It's handled by a bureaucrat. A nice one, I play hockey with him, I think he's here, I enjoy that. But the point of the matter is it's not handled by elected officials. And this budget committee that just was seated last year, if it's so black and white, I'll bet it would take them a year to come up with a default budget, because they had good debates. We have a pretty evenly divided body. I'm not sure what next year's will yield, but regardless, it probably as a New Englander I should say irregardless, but it should be handled by elected officials. And the more of them, in this case, the better, because at least you have a place to go take your case. You can't do it now. If anyone has a problem with the default budget, too bad. It is what it is, and you have to deal with it. So that's my point there. And the tax cap, I favor in some respect. I've heard some sides of it that say, is it toothless? Is it going to hurt the budget committee process? Well, the fact of the matter is, Doug pointed out, that the deliberative session power has always been. I would respectfully say that we have all the town's government here, the leaders of both budgets, and so it's probably the best place for me to say it. It's frustrating as a resident, and it always amazed me when I talk to the people in town that most people don't view the budgets as two totally separate entities. I mean, it just is kind of surprising. I mean, they just look at, this is our government. Why can't the town share their tractor with the school? We've heard this before. And having been in the process, I understand the differences, and it's only because I went through it and lived it, and I understand and respect it. But now that I look back, now that I can look at it as a resident, what really frustrates me is that when, to the town's credit, when it goes through the process, I think the respect for the voter is there. At the deliberative session, to my frustration, when a small group of people can add money to the budget and get it voted on at the floor and have it added to the budget, at least the town leaders respect that. It frustrates me, but they respect it. When it becomes on the ballot and it's voted and it's positively done, they generally do what the voters have asked them to do. I can't say the same for the school district. Very little has changed at the deliberative session. However, at the ballot, we know that there's initiatives that have been voted on by the citizens that have been largely ignored. So I think that the cap is a result of, as Skip said, some mistrust or some loss of trust, because we have a body of government that isn't as open to public comments. So I support these. Unfortunately, I support all of our government. Thank you.
Croc TV.